Do we have anybody who wants to introduce a bill? All right, Mr. Vice Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We have a 23RS 0642. It's an act relating to precinct committee men and committee women, requiring such elected officials to report certain contact information to the county election officer and requiring the county election officer to report such information to the Secretary of State.
There any objections to this bill being introduced? That was brought to us by Representative Fairchild. So. Yes. Okay.
I think it's a different.
Go ahead, Mr. Revisor. Yeah. Any other objections or questions? Okay. If not, the bill is introduced. The next order of business, our committee assistant emailed out minutes for the January 24th meeting. I hope everybody's had a chance to look at them. The chair would entertain a motion. Okay, moved by Representative Dodson, seconded by the ranking minority member. Is there any discussion on the minutes? Okay, seeing none, all in favor of approving the minutes signify by saying aye.
Aye.
All opposed? Okay, the ayes appear to have it. Ayes have it. The minutes are approved. The next order of business is I'd like to open the hearing on House Bill 2057. And we'll begin with Mr. Heim with an overview of the bill.
Mike Heim with the Revisor of Statutes Office. Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, this bill would regulate remote ballot boxes. I'll just kind of run through quickly what it does. One item is the county election office could designate and use not more than one remote ballot box for each election unless they have a population of more than 300,000 30,000, and then they can designate and use one more remote box for each additional group of 30,000. The remote ballot box would have to be continually observed by an employee or monitored by video. They would have to be closed when the election office is closed. They would, on the date of the election, they would have to be closed at 7 o'clock, but somebody waiting in line could go ahead and use it. They would have to have a sign conspicuously posted near the opening of the for the deposit stating the requirements and the statutory limit for the number of advanced voting ballots that a person could drop off, and also stating the penalty for violations. The video recording has to be located to allow recording of the face of each individual depositing the ballots, and has to be preserved for 1 year. It's made a public record, and the bill states it'd be available upon request by any candidate. If it's a public record, it would be available to anybody, for what that's worth. The subsection E provides Secretary of State shall adopt rules and regulations necessary to implement this, including but not limited to rules requiring advanced voting ballots be returned using the ballot box be preserved separately. And anyway, that's the bill.
Right, are there any questions for the revisor in this bill? Representative Dodson.
Just a quick question. The other day when we were at Shawnee, they have a mobile ballot box. I didn't read anything that would preclude that. Is that correct?
If it would be allowed as long as it met the guidelines in this bill, if this bill passes.
Thank you.
Mr. Vice Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Revisor, is this identical to the bill that the Senate considered last year? Or is there any differences between this?
I was going to say it is similar. I haven't compared it word for word. I know there was a consideration in a conference committee of a bill that the Senate was considering. It's very similar, if not identical.
Are there any other questions for the revisor? Okay, seeing none, thank you, Mr. Heim. All right, so we've got a lot of people to testify on this bill, and we've got 2 bills to cover. So I'd like to ask first that the witnesses keep their testimony to 3 minutes or less. If you don't feel compelled to fill that whole 3 minutes, and if somebody else has already said it, I'd appreciate if you just note that you agree with them and then move on so that we can get everybody the opportunity to speak on this bill. And we're going to do all the proponents, do questions, then we're going to do all the opponents, questions, and then neutrals, and then questions. So with that, do we have Madeline Melissa online? All right, so we'll open opponent or proponent testimony with Madeline Melissa from Opportunity Solutions Project.
Thank you, Chairman Proctor and honorable members of the committee. My name is Madeline Melissa, and I'm a visiting fellow at OSP. OSP is a nonpartisan, nonprofit organization, and we work in more than 40 states across the country with one clear goal: to help Americans achieve the American dream. And I appreciate the opportunity to speak today in support of HB 2057. Kansas voters are passionate about the fundamental right that we all have as Americans to vote and participate in the democratic process. They don't want loopholes and weaknesses in the design of elections to threaten that right. HB 2057 will provide important security and transparency measures for remote ballot boxes. Specifically, the bill will require that they're uniformly distributed and equally accessible to all Kansas voters. It will also ensure that advanced voting ballots that are deposited in the boxes are protected by either video recording or continuously observed by an employee in the election office. These security measures will greatly increase voter confidence in the advanced voting process. The bill also provides important administrative guardrails for ballot box use, including that they be closed and not accessible when the county office is closed. The distribution requirement is tied to population, which will assist election officials in rural and geographically large districts. The bill also provides clarity for officials who are tasked with deploying and administering them. I would like to bring the committee's attention to subsection F. As I read the proposed language, remote ballot boxes could be installed at unsecured locations other than a county election office or a satellite advanced voting site. If this was, of course, the drafter's intent, I would suggest adding language that limits them to a secure government building. This is what we've seen other states do, and this will ensure that they are not installed at a private business or an inaccessible building. Ballot boxes were largely unused before the 2020 election, and states across the country have recently enacted drop box reforms. Some states like Missouri and South Carolina have prohibited their use outright, and other states like Iowa and Ohio have enacted similar security measures to what's being considered in this bill that protect voters who choose to use them. The common sense solutions in this bill will add a high level of accountability to the election process. Kansas voters should have confidence that regardless of how they cast their ballots, their votes will count. For all these reasons, I urge you to support this legislation. Thank you for your time, and of course, I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you. Is there any questions for the conferee? Representative Neighbors.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for your testimony today. Can you tell me of instances in Kansas where we've had problems with the voting boxes being unsecure?
Well, I'll tell you this. We don't necessarily know that because there isn't video surveillance on the boxes currently. And I can tell you that across the country, we've seen problems. For example, during the 2020 election, in ballot boxes in California and Boston were both actually lit on fire, which of course, as you might imagine, is a huge administrative nightmare for election officials who are dealing with the cleanup and of course, not protecting the ballots that were cast in those boxes.
I guess the reason I asked that question is from our Secretary of State, it doesn't appear that we've had a problem with them. And the ones we have seen are extremely secure. And that's why I just wanted clarity on how this was happening in Kansas. Thank you.
There any other questions for the conferee? Representative Hoagland?
Is she the only proponent?
Yes.
Is she from Kansas?
I would ask the conferee.
Are you from Kansas, ma'am?
No, I'm not from Kansas.
So we don't have any proponents from Kansas. Thank you.
All right, are there any other questions for the conferee? If not, thank you for your testimony. We'll move on to opponent testimony. And the first opponent is Mr. Clay Barker.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. The Secretary of State opposes this bill. I'll make my summary comments. There's a lot of people behind me that'll probably have similar comments. We oppose it for 4 reasons. First, the 30,000 one drop box per 30,000 registered voters seems to be an arbitrary number. I believe it came from a misreading of a California statute that says you have to have one drop box for at least every 30,000. Their counties are a lot bigger than ours. Second, the provision that the drop boxes be open only when the county election office is open somewhat defeats the purpose of drop boxes, which is partially to help people who can't go to the county election office, drop their ballot off. Maybe they work during the day and they're only available at night. Third, there's some other administrative issues that I think the county clerks will address in their testimony. And fourth, this bill seems to run against the central theme of Kansas elections, which is they're run at the local level decentralized. I mean, we don't like it when Washington, D.C. tells our state how to run its elections. And yes, there has to be some common doctrine for counties to operate in, statutes and regulation, but within that parameter, let the counties decide what to do. And I don't know if it made it into the testimony just yet, but we sent a spreadsheet of how many drop boxes per county there were, both in use in 2020 and 2022. And the number went down quite a bit for 2022 because the county election officers realized they didn't need them for a lower turnout election. So they're able to make their own decisions on generally how to use drop boxes. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. The next conferee is Mike Taylor from Kansas County Commissioners Association.
Thank you. Good afternoon, committee. I'm representing the Kansas County Commissioners Association. That represents all the elected commissioners in all 105 counties. We are opposing this bill because we think it's going to disenfranchise many, many voters who depend on easy access to those drop boxes. We also think it's going to add a lot of unneeded expense to the counties and the taxpayers. We also have been told that had this been in place in 2020, as many as 32,000 legitimate ballots would have been just thrown out and not counted. So under this, and Mr. Barger just mentioned this, more than 30 counties would have to reduce or eliminate the use of drop boxes. Or we've been told that many county election officers would have to hire additional staff to monitor the boxes or spend money on video equipment, which is all very expensive to try to monitor those boxes. So we think cost-wise, it's going to make these really unusable. The other thing I would say is if the video cameras have to show the face of the person that's dropping off stuff, I would question how that violates the privacy of a voter. So anyway, in our rural counties especially, where the courthouse might be 60 miles away from where someone lives, the drop boxes make it a lot more convenient for those people to vote. I would say this, paired with 2056, which would shorten the time for when the ballots have to be in by 7 p.m. on Election Day, and then you're going to make it harder with drop boxes. When we have the Secretary of State who says there wasn't any fraud and the Kansas elections were as secure as he's ever seen them, what is the real purpose behind
I need you to wrap up, sir.
I'm done.
3 minutes. Okay. Thank you. Mr. Rick Fifo.
Hello, my name is Rick Pifo. I'm the chair of the Elections Committee for the Kansas County Clerks and Election Officials Association, which includes all, election officials from every county in Kansas. We're opposed to this bill, basically every section of it. The limiting to 30,000 doesn't allow for smaller counties that may have cities, or large geographical area, but have cities that they may put a drop box in a city to allow it to be more convenient. So they would only be allowed to have one box. In my county, I have 23,000 registered voters. I currently have 2 drop boxes, one outside the courthouse, one outside of our South Fire Station in the city of Newton. And people like having that second box because we have a population down in the south part of town and the south part of the county. For us, we had in 2020, 50% of our advanced ballots that were returned were in remote drop boxes. And in 2022, it was about 34%. It's a good tool, especially with the mistrust in the delivery by the post office. It's another tool for the voters to use to get their ballots returned to us. The feasibility of having an employee stationed at the box while we're open is, I mean, you got to remember, it's Kansas weather. We're talking August and November. So you want a person standing outside, and that person's not a law enforcement person, so what would they do even if they saw a violation? Our boxes are currently monitored by peripherally by our sheriff's office that has a view of the box at the courthouse. The fire station has cameras set up. But the problem is there's a provision in here that says you have to maintain that video for a year. Most camera systems work on a 30, 60-day loop. So we would have to, if we didn't already, I would have to install new cameras to view the face. Plus I'd have to have a camera system that would allow me to keep that video for a year. That's a long time and costly. And this is all out of county budgets because you all know that the state pays nothing for elections. So that's it. I'll stand for questions when appropriate. Thank you.
All right, our next conferee is Maciel King from the League of Women Voters, Kansas.
Thank you, Chair, for allowing me to speak to you again and committee members. I am Seal King. I'm with the League of Women Voters of Kansas. I'm Advocacy Chair. And we do oppose House Bill 2057. And for many of the reasons that you've already heard, we think that limiting ballot boxes to 1 per 30,000 overrides what counties know to be best within their counties. I had one county clerk tell me that, well, they've got 2 small cities, and if they can't put a ballot box in both cities, they probably don't feel like they can use a ballot box at all. And requiring facial video and kept for a year, these are all perhaps costly and, as we've heard, unnecessary. The goal of a representative government is to have as many citizens participate in elections and civic endeavors as possible. Those who participate in voting are shown to have a healthier, more stable society, and ballot drop boxes help with voter participation. During his presentation to the House Election Committee on February 8th of last year, Secretary of State Schwab said that the drop boxes are secure and more reliable than a U.S. Postal Service due to the following. Ballots go directly to the county election office instead of being sent out of state. Ballots are collected by election workers, 1 from each party. The drop boxes are under video scrutiny generally, unlike U.S. Postal Service boxes. They're not always under video scrutiny. And U.S. postal boxes where people might drop their ballots are open 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. We don't understand why ballot drop boxes would have more requirements than a U.S. Postal Service drop box. And right now, all the boxes are emptied or locked at 7 o'clock on Election Day. We would like to, they've been used for decades. So even when there wasn't something called a ballot box, there's in a lot of counties a drop box for county business, and people would drop their ballots in there just as they would their taxes or their whatever form they might have. Those are the major points I wanted to make, and I appreciate your time today. There are a few other notes on my testimony. So I'll be glad to stand for questions when appropriate.
Thank you. All right, our next conferee is Melissa Steeler. Styler? Second time go. Welcome to the committee.
Chair Proctor, members of the committee, good to see you all again so soon, right? I'm not going to go through all of the details about the problems of this bill. I'll remind you all that I am a voter and a resident here in Topeka, Kansas, and as Representative Dodson pointed out, a lot of the restrictions that are in this legislation are already in place here in Topeka, so I just want to tell you what it's like to actually vote with these restrictions in place so you can take that into account whenever you're thinking about how your constituents are going to be impacted by this bill. So let me just say it plain, it's awful. This is the hardest place to early vote I've ever lived. The traveling voting drop boxes that happen in Topeka, the schedule is sporadic, nobody knows where to find them, they move around from day to day, unless you know where to look or who to ask, they're completely inaccessible. Typically what's good about remote ballot drop boxes is you see it and it's a reminder and you say, oh, that's where I can go and cast my ballot, but that's not the case with these staffed drop boxes that are also, again, only during business hours. So effectively, Shawnee County has already instituted a lot of these things. And for the 2020 general election, I'll just kind of share what that looks like so that way you can have a better idea. So the only location where there's an advanced ballot drop box is in the only early voting location, which is in the county elections office. I know you all went and visited it, so I'm not going to go through all of Topeka's policies. But I live about 5 minutes from the State House here, so you all are quite familiar with my neighborhood. It's about a 15-minute, 20-minute ride to the elections office from here, which you all have driven to. However, if I were to have to take public transportation from here to the elections office, it's either a 50-minute bus ride with 2 transfers or a 33-minute bus ride with a 20-minute walk that's about a mile long. If I were to take a ride share, I checked the prices of this over the span of the last week. It averages about $20 one way without tipping your driver. I checked on the bus routes too to see, during early voting, the elections office is open until 7 p.m., but they have no weekend hours. So I, somebody who works during the week and often frequently on weekends too, but when would I actually have to leave my house to get there on time? The latest I could possibly leave would be 5:30, and I'd have to walk a mile in order to get to the closest bus route that would actually take me to that location. This is the best case scenario because obviously Topeka is a urban core with a robust public transportation system, and even for me to go and vote at a remote ballot drop box that's monitored during business hours, it would be ridiculously difficult to do. And I know because I had to do it in the general 2020 election. So if you have any questions about what it's actually like for voters who are working through this system, I would be happy to stand for questions later, and I will direct you all for more details at my written testimony as well. Thank you.
Thank you. Our next conferee is Stacy Knoll. Did I get that right? Noel? Noel? Nell, I'm sorry, and you told me the last time. I very much apologize.
I married in. I tried to ask him to change it, but he said no. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you for the opportunity to come here and address this. Again, I'm probably going to say a lot of what's been said and the people behind me, so I too will just sort of, as the Executive Director of the Kansas African American Affairs Commission, I feel the need to point out the history of voting in this country and how one of the things that I think we can say is that the moral arc is long and bends towards justice. So I will always stand for any policy that makes it easier for people to vote. The history, if it took the 19th Amendment to get women the right to vote, and it took the Voting Rights Act of 1964 to get Black people the right to vote, I think we can be a part of this continuing to build towards having a more equitable, expanded access to voting. Also, part of that is remote ballot boxes. Again, I referenced a lot of things in my testimony. I know in 2021, in Johnson County, 14,917 ballots came in through the 8 freestanding ballot boxes in the Johnson County. One of those was mine. And to talk about the aspects in this bill, I myself, as many of you know, to get here on time at 8:30 means I need to leave Johnson County at 6:45, which is not during business hours in order for me to vote. So in the general election of 2021, I was like, oh my gosh, I have to vote. Oh, I'll just drop my ballot off. And so that was the best way for me to vote. I think it's, we could spend time asking why 14,000 people decided to vote with remote ballot boxes, but I think that's not the question. The question should be, or the answer should be, that for those 14,000 people, this was the least restrictive way for them to cast their ballot. And I think it is part of the government's job to make voting as accessible and as equitable as we can for the people who need to vote. So again, I want to reiterate what another conferee said. If we take this bill in conjunction with other bills that are just making it more difficult to vote for various reasons, either not having a 3-day extended period, I just oppose these on the moral stance of that we need to make it more easy for people to vote in this country. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Our next conferee is Caleb Smith from Kansas Appleseed.
Thank you for the opportunity to address this bill. I'm Caleb Smith with Kansas Appleseed, and I'll try to keep this as short as possible because it seems like a lot of us are sort of having the same ideas of why this is a bad bill for Kansas. So we oppose this bill, first of all, because ballot boxes help people vote. Many studies show that they can actually increase voter turnout by as much as 7%, which is a huge number. Many political campaigns that are paid a lot of money and put a lot of resources into encouraging turnout with their base spend millions of dollars, and they can't touch those numbers. They can usually get between 3 to 5%. So just the act of having a remote ballot box is already a positive good to encourage voter turnout. And as such, the use of these boxes should be encouraged, not discouraged, which frankly seems to be the goal of this bill, to make it so hard to implement ballot drop boxes that a lot of county officials just sort of give up and take them inside and just don't have them. Some other points that we wanted to make was that, of course, this would be an expensive proposition. Hiring an employee at a small rural county clerk's office just to watch a box of envelopes, essentially, it's an expensive thing to do. And maybe not something that a lot of rural county clerks just have it in their budgets to pay for. And frankly, taxpayers also shouldn't have to foot the bill just to keep an eye on these ballots. Some other things we wanted to really point out was that it simply makes it harder to vote, but also it forces counties to just make this really tough decision. Are we going to pay all this money to make sure that we keep in compliance with this new bill that really just seems like it wants to make it harder to vote? Or do we, pay for other things? Do we put this money that we could have had otherwise and put it towards things that might actually make elections more secure? Which is sort of the irony of this bill, is it might actually make elections less secure, in that county clerks could be taking these employees' time and be doing things that could actually make them more secure. They could have more employees out there administering elections, doing paperwork, whatever it would be, but they could do something that they actually deem necessary to make elections more safe and secure. So with those reasons, I'll wrap it up. But just Kansas Appleseed opposes HB 2057, and I'll be glad to answer questions at the appropriate time.
Thank you. Our next conferee is Paris Raitt. Did I get that right? Awesome. Welcome to the committee.
Chair Proctor and members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to provide testimony on the proposed HB 2057. I'm a resident of Lawrence in House District 44, and I'm opposed to HB 2057 because of its accessibility issues. When I read this bill, I immediately thought of all the working class people out there who take advantage of Kansas ballot box accessibility. Since I've been voting, I've used mail-in ballots frequently. It was the best option for me as I went to school full-time on top of working as a certified nursing assistant in a care home during the pandemic, sometimes working 16-hour shifts regularly to bring in income. Luckily, during the election season, I knew that this kind of schedule wouldn't get in the way of voting, something I strongly value because ballot boxes here are open 24/7. I'm a forgetful person, and with a full-time work and school schedule, I needed to have flexibility to vote. That includes having evening and weekend opportunities. If this bill were around then, I wouldn't have that security as a voter. Having drop boxes only open during office hours would leave so many working class ballots behind. Humans err. It's a fact of life. It is totally plausible that someone would forget their ballot till the last moment through the course of day-to-day life. Luckily, here in Kansas, we provide multiple opportunities for any Kansan to get their ballot in. Let's keep it that way. I urge you to please vote no on HB 2057 and continue to allow safe and accessible voting by drop box for all future Kansas elections. Thank you for your time.
Thank you. Our next conferee is Mike Burgess from Disability Rights Center.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chair. And as the chair did an excellent job, I'm Mike Burgess, and I'm the Director of Policy and Outreach at the Disability Rights Center of Kansas. So I will say a lot of we agree. Obviously, we're looking at all of this through the lens of disability. So as you've heard the other challenges of the other conferees, add in the layers of complexity of disability on top of that. So if that's individuals with mobility challenges, such as war veterans with quadriplegia, paraplegia, et cetera, those would be in the ranks of folks who are going to have a harder time with anything that ends up reducing the accessibility of voting. And so that's kind of our general fundamental concern with this bill and with others that we view that would be either erecting a barrier or making it harder for people with disabilities to have their vote counted. And this can play out too, because some of the folks require overnight care, and it may be their overnight staff who is assisting them with this and needs the drop box. So that's with the kind of the potential limitations on the hours that the drop boxes would be available and or the locations. That's our concern. And then, as was previously stated with public transportation, disability transportation is that much more. It's more like the cable company in a lot of cases. They give you a multi-hour window when they're going to pick you up and when they may drop you off. And it's a much, as the high burden it is, it's an even higher burden for individuals with disabilities to be able to get there and do that. And so with that, Mr. Chair, gosh, I've not had enough coffee today. But I ask you to oppose, or appreciate you allowing us to share our concerns with this legislation and urge you to oppose 2057. And I'd be happy to stand for questions at the appropriate time.
Thank you. I won't take offense at being misgendered. All right. Our next conferee is Mr. Davis Hammett from Loudlight.
Thank you, Chair Proctor and members of the committee. Again, I won't go over the same points in my testimony. I sort of have a section-by-section comment on this, but sort of this fundamental question, again, I want to get at is what is the justification for this and why? I think we're in a difficult position because, there's only one proponent in this case, Opportunity Solutions Project, and there's sort of a broad statement. There's not a specific reason that this is being called for. We don't really have an evidence-based problem that's being resolved here. And so it's sort of hard to counteract of nothing, right? Like there's been nothing put forward to sort of justify why this legislation would be called for. And that's concerning because what we do know, again, is that there's real concerns about how this might impact access for certain people. Particularly working class folks, and we think of instances like down in Sedgwick County, where you might be, working the aviation industry, long shifts, and just want to drop off your ballot on your way home, but now that option might be taken away from you. Also, counties have relied on these types of options and adjusted how they act. They've reduced polling places because they know enough mail ballots will come in. And so there's like sort of counterbalancing that you have to consider in these things, that counties have come to these decisions for a reason. So with that, I also do really quickly want to mention that where this bill came from, it actually wasn't a Senate bill last year, which is unfortunate because I had hoped that I could just copy and paste my testimony, and I was like, where the heck is it? This was sort of made on the fly and inserted into a bill late in the session in the Senate committee, and so it kind of came out of a thin air. And even the senator introducing it had said, when he was asked at the time, he said 60,000 registered voters, and he said the number sounded good. So that was sort of the justification. So again, I would say this really isn't based on any evidence or research or best practices. And so I don't understand why you would sort of advance this. So I'm happy to stand for questions when appropriate, and thank you so much for your time.
Thank you very much. Our last opponent is Rija Nazir, and I apologize if I've butchered that name, who's with us on WebEx.
Yes, that was perfect. Chair Proctor, members of the committee, I appreciate you all giving me the time today to speak in regard to House Bill 2057. I'm a resident of Wichita in House District 85, and I am opposed to this bill. As a recent graduate of Wichita State University, I have seen firsthand how all communities, including students, benefit from the accessibility of a ballot drop box. I've seen students, faculty, and members of the Fairmount community whose lives have been seriously altered by the effects of COVID-19 still use their right to vote by reaching locations to drop off their ballots. However, the utility of drop boxes are becoming unnecessarily confusing to Kansans. Young and seasoned voters alike are continuously thrown obstacles to overcome in order to voice their concerns to anyone in this building. The limiting of ballot boxes per residence cannot possibly be seen as beneficial to a voter or their representative. The overregulating of a simple yet vital resource to our democracy is not going to improve the state of our elections. Our elections are fair, lawful, and secure. As more young and disenfranchised voters finally learn to voice themselves through their vote, it seems as if more restrictions and misinformation are thrown their way. This is no way to maintain equitable elections in our great state. Rather than compromising the integrity of a voting method that has been deemed safe and secure by our very own Secretary of State, I urge you to question the issues voters are actually facing during our elections. Extreme wait times, turning away voters who are in line at 7 p.m., misinformation, extreme restrictions on voter registration, and the overwhelming dismissal of young voters who are making voting a simple task for all parties. Rather than trying to hinder each other, the legislature should be trying to ease the burdens of those who put them in this building. I myself, along with thousands of other voters, put trust in elected officials who are not misguided by false, hypothetical claims and trust the process that granted them the authority to improve our state's elections. Before voting on this bill, I strongly encourage you all to imagine yourselves as your constituents. Imagine yourself as an overworked college student during a pandemic, a member of a historically overlooked neighborhood, or an individual with limited mobility. How would it feel if your representative made it even harder for you to vote? As one of those constituents, I ask you all to take the expertise of actual Kansans who have actually voted in Kansas elections and vote no on HB 2057. Thank you.
Thank you. That's our final conferee that I have listed. Is there anybody else wishing to speak as an opponent on this bill? Okay, so seeing none, I will move to questions. Does anyone on the committee have a question for any of the opponents? Go ahead, Representative Collins.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. This is mostly for the representative from the Secretary of State's office or for the county clerk's offices. Do y'all have any information or know about any real problems that have happened at drop boxes?
Mr. Chair, Clay Barker from the Secretary of State. In the 2020 and 2022 elections, we are not aware of any problems of voters using a drop box to transmit a mail ballot to the county election officer. The security is when the ballot's requested, the voters checked, and when it comes back, the signature's checked, and there's some other provisions in there. We're not aware of any problems.
Well,
I have not heard of any either. I mean, if you're talking about security of the boxes themselves, like trying to set them on fire or anything like that, we haven't heard any stories like that in Kansas.
Okay, and I've been hearing about people like at drop boxes trying to keep people, like say that they perceive someone coming to a drop box as being a mule, if you're familiar with that term, and people being harassed, when they're going to drop their ballot in. Have you heard anything like that about that?
I've seen it in other states. Yeah. We had one report from Johnson County of a voter that said he dropped his ballot off and somebody across the street was yelling at him, but nothing occurred, and we informed law enforcement.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Any other questions for the conferees? Mr. Vice Chairman.
If I could have the gentleman from the Disability Rights Center, Mr. Burgess. I guess kind of my hypothetical to you, I mean, many of the conferees spoke about accessibility and such, and somehow this would be a limit. And, you know, persons who would be disabled, I think, would be most clearly the people who accessibility is a big issue. But where you have the fact that you can just drop it in the U.S. Post Office, you know, mailbox, of which there's plenty all around town, how would it actually be a limit to accessibility of voting?
Well, as on the previous hearing, we talked about the challenges of the mail system and so the timelines around that. So depending upon the situations and the specifics. Additionally, as I shared in my previous testimony too, for an individual with mobility challenges or dexterity challenges, it's not as simple as just running out to do it. So while that, we appreciate those options and want to continue to have those as options. I mean, in this case, if you are limiting the hours, we know that a number of individuals with disabilities, I mean, they utilize both the permanent advance ballot as well as there's a number of individuals who each election they may like to vote in person, or they may decide to utilize, just like anyone else, voting in person or requesting advance voting by mail and then returning it this way. So if you're reducing that, it's going to have a disproportionate impact on people with disabilities as well.
Okay, fair enough.
Thank you.
Can I have Rick Pyfo please come up? Yeah, Rick, the question I would have is you know, I think part of the concern that's kind of driven bills like this, you know, has been, you know, partly the whole notion, and one of the representatives kind of mentioned of what are called mules, as far as that somehow somebody's going to stuff a ballot box akin to, you know, there was a documentary called 2,000 Mules that came out like a year ago. I mean, is there any legitimacy to that concern given the state of Kansas's other security procedures, or what is your comment on that possibility?
I'm not sure that this bill addresses that, because if I put a clerk employee out at the box, like I said before, they are not law enforcement. What could they really do to stop that, even if they saw somebody trying to put 20 ballots in the box? The video surveillance might show so that the attorney or whatever could prosecute afterwards, but are we, the clerk's offices, expected to be the law enforcement, you know, for enforcing that 15 ballot rule? I mean, we have the evidence on the ballots themselves. If they're signing and that they're delivering the ballots, we can find out, I guess, that there's more than 15 or 10 or whatever the number is. But like I said, we're not law enforcement. We don't carry guns. I mean, our sheriff is right there next to our ballot box, but.
If I may follow up, but isn't the real security that you guys have for the ballot is the fact that it has to match, I mean, that, you know, that you only accept ballots that have already been sent out by somebody that had requested it. I mean, someone can't just Xerox 100 ballots and somehow stuff them in a, you know, I mean, that is fundamentally your security measure isn't, you know, any sort of video or person on the ground. It's the fact that it has to match your records back at the county clerk's office. Is that not correct?
Correct. The numbers all have to balance. We mail you the ballot, you send it back, and we match the signatures. And so the forging ballots and stuffing a bunch of them in the box, I don't see how that could happen, or if it did, we would find out right away. So
very good. Thank you.
So since you're up there.
Okay.
What you mentioned the law that we passed, I can't remember if it was last year or 2 years ago, that made it so an individual could only turn in 10 ballots that aren't his own or a family member's or somebody they're providing care to. What's your mechanism right now, and what's the mechanism for clerks across the state right now to make sure that people aren't turning in more than 10 ballots?
Well, there was nothing included in that bill that gave us the power or even suggested that we actively monitor that. We collect the evidence. If an accusation would be made, we collect the evidence, but there was nothing in that bill, and we tried to make it clear at the time, is this another task that we have to try to, you know, go through and monitor all these, and then if somebody does deliver more than 10, are the ballots good? It was determined at the time that regardless of whether somebody brought more than 10, we still get to count the ballots. So, I mean, if that's a whole separate issue, if you want to task us or the sheriff or whoever with actually monitoring that video, I mean, if, say we don't have an employee out there, video, are you saying that we have to have somebody monitoring that video every moment of every day while the box is open so that we can try to catch a crime in progress? Or is it to have the evidence to prosecute afterwards?
And I don't want anybody to take from this that I support or don't support this bill. I'm still here in conferees. But are there any rules at all right now for the execution of drop boxes?
There really aren't. I mean, a lot of counties have used them for years. In our county, like they talked about, we've always had a drop box outside the courthouse for treasurer payments and stuff like that. And it's always been allowed to drop ballots in that box. We didn't make it widely known, but if somebody said, hey, I've got a ballot, how do I get it back to you? I guess, yeah, there really aren't any, and that's why we're supporting the next bill that actually has rules and regs.
Okay. Any other questions? Representative Neighbors.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This is for Mr. Barker, please. Okay, as far as the security is concerned, the drop boxes are more secure than the mail per se. Would you agree with that?
Yes, we would.
And if there is, let's say, a bad weather condition, like we had 12 inches of snow, and there were a couple days we didn't even get mail because the drivers couldn't get around. If it were during election season, how would you handle that? You would pick them up anyway, is that correct?
We passed on guidance to the counties.
Okay.
It wasn't binding because we didn't have authority for that. But we urged them to empty the drop box at least once a day. So if voters put their ballot in, it would show up at the county elections that night or the next morning. Some counties actually had a sheriff's deputy go with their election workers. Most didn't, but they always sent 2 election workers, one from each party, to pick up the ballots.
And then my last question, if I may, Mr. Chairman. I've had several emails about privacy on people taking pictures of people dropping their ballots in the drop box. Is there anything that, or what would you say to their concern about that being a private issue? Because we're not photographed when we go and make our ballot or go to the election office, but they are being photographed and they find that an infringement on their privacy.
I can understand their concern. I don't have a good answer for you because you could have the same argument putting a ballot in a post box that someone in a public place can take a picture of someone else in a public place. It's a little different than a polling place where there's no pictures allowed inside while people are actually filling out their ballot. Here, the ballot's already filled out in a sealed envelope and it's just being put in a container. I can understand the concern if somebody is there with a video camera watching the drop box the entire time.
And there's a big difference between dropping it in the regular U.S. mail, because there aren't people out there taking pictures of people dropping their mail in the mailbox and dropping them in the drop box. So it is a little bit more intrusive from that point. I mean, this bill, I think, makes it more intrusive. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Before you sit down, it's a public record who's voted, though. Anybody can go to their county clerk and get a list of who's voted. Isn't that correct?
Yes, anyone can go to the county clerk or the Secretary of State. You pay the standard fee and you get a list, depending on what you ask for, but a voter registration list, name, phone number, address, date of birth, last 10 elections you voted in, and most counties can tell you how they voted, mail or in person or early in person.
But is there any public record for people who turn in ballots? Getting back to that point of not being allowed to turn in more than 10 ballots that aren't your own. Is that a public record who turned in a ballot?
If the county scans the ballot envelope, you'd you'd have to go through a lot of envelopes to see if somebody signed as the assister more than 10 times, but there's no specific record of that. It'd be indirect.
All right, so committee, last question here. Let's see. Okay, I'm gonna go ahead, Representative Hogan. I'll let you ask your question, Representative Howell, and then we got to move on.
Mine's actually just an observation that all of the opponents were from Kansas and our constituents.
Okay, thank you. Representative Howell.
I have a list, but I'll just stick to one or two. If I could ask Rick, I think would probably be the best person to pick on. I'll be super nice, though, I promise. Thank you. Just in regards to things like loss of ballots, having security by video surveillance, things of that nature, would you say, based on your experience, that if you had a mail ballot that you needed to drop off, would you personally feel like you had more security at ballot boxes in Kansas than at the USPS mailboxes? Or
Yes,
vice versa?
I believe that, yes, it would. I'm not sure it would necessarily be a security issue for me. It's more of a assurance that the election officer is going to get it in a timely manner. I mean, I would say that the drop box is more secure than the post office because post office goes through a lot of hands before it gets from you to me. But.
Thank you. And then just one
That's
brief
questions.
Okay.
Go ahead.
Is that
Go ahead.
okay? If you don't want me to, that's okay.
Go ahead.
All right, just real quickly. I did happen to speak to a board of canvasser that I happen to have easy access to. But would you agree that requiring the county election office to actually personally own and maintain the digital preservation of the video for a year would be very expensive and challenging for all the counties to comply with?
It would be difficult and expensive. I mean, I've looked into that for our own operation. I mean, I've added some cameras in my vote room. I could expand that for, well, I'd only be limited to one box, so I wouldn't have to worry about the remote issues of having one at the fire station. It becomes a whole nother issue with remote cameras and getting them to tie back into the system. But yeah, those systems are not cheap.
All right. Thank you, Representative. Thank you, Mr. FIFO. I'm going to have to end it there because we've got a lot of work to do here as a committee and count days. We got like 2 weeks left. So, I would direct everybody's attention to the written opponent testimony that's online. I'm not going to read all the names in the interest of time. And I don't have any neutrals listed to testify. Is there anybody wishing to testify as a neutral on this bill? Or anybody wishing to speak at all to this bill? Okay, seeing none, we're going to close the hearing on House Bill 2057 and open the hearing on House Bill 2053. Mr. Heim, could you give us a rundown? I'm sorry, Representative Berquist.
Did you say 2057?
Yeah, we're closing the hearing on 2057 and opening on 20. Did I screw up? No. Okay. All right, Mr. Heim, I apologize.
Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, House Bill 2053 is a short bill. It provides the Secretary of State shall adopt rules and regulations for the use of remote ballot boxes. It lists things that would be in the regulations to include the dates, times, and locations, and any other requirements that the Secretary of State feels necessary to preserve the integrity of the ballots in the election process. Remote ballot boxes would not include any ballot boxes located in a county election office or satellite advanced voting site. So that's it.
Any questions for the reviser? Okay, seeing none, thank you, Mr. Heim. We're going to begin with proponent testimony and all the same rules in the interest of time here. So I would like to call Mr. Clay Barker from Secretary of State's office as first proponent.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Clay Barker from the Kansas Secretary of State. Secretary Schwab supports HB 2053 that gives us authority to issue regulations governing drop boxes. And I'll try to be quick here. The statute, we believe, that gave authority for counties or clarified that they could use drop boxes and other methods of receiving mail ballots was an amendment made in 1978. But drop boxes really surged in Kansas in 2020, the COVID election, and that's because simultaneously a lot of people were concerned about going to polling places, and then a little later on there was a large concern about the U.S. Postal Service. I don't know if you remember in 2020, it kind of fades in my mind too. There were news stories about the head of the Postal Service moving equipment around. You couldn't trust the post office to deliver. And then when we received federal money, the counties told us the thing we could buy in bulk to get a lower price that would benefit them the most was drop boxes. And many counties, probably most, got one or two from the federal funds. Some used county money to buy them. Some already had them before. And if you want to know right now, and this is the 2022 numbers, 20 counties don't use them at all. 45 only had one box. 27 had two boxes. 6 counties had 3 boxes, and it was only 7 counties have more than that, the larger ones. Sedgwick has the most, Johnson, Riley, Douglas. Why do we, okay, sorry, let me back up 1 second. Drop boxes are just the way we look at it, is a tool to help the county election officers conduct their elections. It's not a magic bullet for a perfect election. Losing them wouldn't destroy the election system, but it's a net benefit to the counties. And they should be allowed the discretion within certain rules to use them as they see fit. And the Vice Chair had asked about, I think, came up with time. If I was a week before the election, I had a mail ballot, I would not trust the Postal Service to get it there. But if I couldn't somehow otherwise deliver it, the drop box is the way to do it. We have 3 reasons why we believe regulations are a benefit over just a non-regulated use. First, because they will provide some basic floor general uniform standards, specifically on security, both at the drop box has certain physical security standards, weather, also chain of custody of the ballots could be included, and for disability access. Department of Justice has put out guidelines of how to use drop boxes. Second reason for regulations is it provides essentially a safe harbor or protection for county election officers. If you follow these rules, you have met the standard. And third, I realize, probably some of you more than others, there is concern out there about drop boxes, 2,000 mules, ballot harvesting, and this is a way to respond to it. If you want to know how the regulations are issued, I would probably draft it. I'd send it to Mr. Caskey, who would cover my draft in red ink. We'd come up with something that works. We'd then give it to the clerks, probably a working group or all of them. They would provide more input. Department of Administration checks it for form. Attorney General checks it to make sure it's in compliance with statutes. Public hearing input, and then JCAR, the Legislative Commission, can give input, and then it will become a regulation. So there's a lot of input to this process. And as far as references go, I've already got a stack in my office, other state laws and government best practices. Thank you. I'll stand
Thank you.
for questions.
Just 3 minutes is up. I'm just trying to keep us honest, not give either side any advantage here. So, Mr. Pifo, if you could come up and talk to us.
Yes. We support this legislation if it's the will of the body to have more standardized regulations on drop boxes. We think this is the way to do it, and we look forward to working with Secretary of State's office as we have on previous rules and regs to come up with workable, secure solution. So I think that's it.
Thank you. All right, our final proponent that's going to be testifying orally is Ms. Seal King from the League of Women Voters.
Thank you again, Chair and Committee. Seal King with the League of Women Voters of Kansas, and we do support this bill. Nice to be in the company of all the other officials here. And so we do think there is advantage to having rules and regulations so that you have a ground floor and you have all the county election offices would know what to expect of them. We believe that drop boxes are important assets to voter participation. And that the county offices should have those rules and regulations to follow. We note that there is the Election Assistance Commission, the EAC, is one source for rules and regulations for ballot drop boxes, and we give a link there and suggest that you and they maybe follow those rules, and some of them were that they set a minimum of a drop box for 10 to 15,000. That was a minimum, and state that if you have rural areas that are harder for people to get around in, that you might want to put a drop box in more places to make it handier. And I think many of those notes were in my previous testimony even, about some of the standard best practices that the nation uses for drop boxes. And I'd be happy to stand for questions when appropriate.
Okay, thank you very much. I'll direct the committee's attention to written proponent testimony, and I will open the floor for any questions for our proponents. Does anybody have any questions? Mr. Ranking Minority Member.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. My question's for Clay Barker with the Secretary of State's office. Clay, thanks for being here. Thanks for your testimony. I think many of us have a lot of confidence in our current Secretary of State, but I have some concerns. So I'm wondering if your interpretation of this bill, if a future Secretary of State could use this as to change rules and regs to ban drop boxes in the state of Kansas.
Mr. Ranking Minority Leader, I'm not sure if they could use it to ban them, but a future Secretary of State could amend the regulations in a way to make the use more restrictive, just the same way the legislature could change laws. It seems that the statute intended for drop boxes to be used, so I'm not sure how far you could go in banning them through regulations.
Okay. Thank you.
I haven't looked at that.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
To follow up, Clay, there's a law in the books that permits, you said, I can't remember what year you said, but it's a 70s law that permits the use of drop boxes.
Yes, that's the way our office has looked at it and the counties have, but it's a very generic statement. It allows ballots to be delivered by FedEx or UPS or Dropbox. It seemed to give the counties a lot of flexibility, but it is not specific to drop boxes.
Okay, thank you. Any other questions for our proponents? Okay. I saw one finger up, so that's one question, right?
I will just, if I could, with Mr. Barker, if you would. I am not seeing in this bill anything that actually says that the Secretary of State's office has to confer with the county election officers in it. Am I missing that when I read through there? I know you mentioned that you tend to, but what would, again, same as Representative Woodard, what is to make sure that future Secretary of States follow that same rule and policy?
You're entirely correct. The statutes governing the issuing of regulations, the agency writes it, sends it to the Department of Administration, to the Attorney General. I was telling you, and I will commit to the committee, that we would get input from the county election officers. They're the ones on the ground actually using these boxes.
All right. Any other questions? Okay, I'd like to move along if I can. Any? All right. So that concludes our proponent testimony. Is there anybody wishing to speak as a proponent that isn't listed? Okay, seeing none, we'll move to opponent testimony. Our first conferee is Mr. Mike Burgess from the Disability Rights Center.
All right, thank you, Mr. Chair. Again, Mike Burgess with the Disability Rights Center of Kansas, and just being very brief, our concern isn't so much with rules and regs or with this. It would just be, we wanted to register our concerns that this process could be used to functionally limit the dates and times and locations which are specifically mentioned in the bill. While there are certainly beneficial and secure ways to do that, but there are also ways that could have very negative impacts on individuals with disabilities. And so that's the nature of our opposition with this. And again, just with the process, once that rule and reg authority is there, it's they go through the process that the previous conferee talked about, and they become, those regs are amended or they're in place with very little, there's public input, but there's no requirement to make any changes or do anything with that. So thank you, Mr. Chair. I'd be happy to stand for questions.
Thank you very much. And our second opponent is Mr. Davis Hammett from Loud Light.
Thank you, Chairman Proctor and members of the committee. First, I want to say I actually do understand the problem here, and I think there is a clear issue that there's sort of no basic standards, and so counties kind of have to wing it, and I do think that it's a good idea to have some basic standards here. One thing that I saw that I think is a potential issue in this bill is the definition within Section 1B. How it defines remote ballot drop boxes appears in my reading to include the poll site ballot drop boxes. So what happens here is you can bring your ballot, your mail ballot into a poll site within the county on election day. And sometimes they handle it a little differently, but sometimes there's a locked box at the check-in and they allow you to drop it in. And under this, that doesn't appear to be exempt, but I think that might be the intention because advanced polling sites and other things are exempt. So I think that might just be sort of inserting a word to clarify that is something that y'all should consider if you move forward with this. And then, as I said, I understand the sort of intention behind this and support that. However, I just feel like I need to raise the concern of the unknown impact of, you know, if we're 4 years from now and a Secretary of State does use the rule and regs process to, although maybe not explicitly ban them, create such unrealistic restrictions on them that a county wouldn't actually be able to implement them. And I don't want to be in a position where 4 years from now someone says, you support this, and they were banned under this. So with that, I'm happy to stand for questions when appropriate.
Okay, thank you. I'll direct the committee's attention to two written opponents with written testimony only, and then I'll open up the floor if anybody has any questions for our conferees speaking in opposition. That might be a first in this committee. All right, I'm not gonna spoil it by asking any questions then. All right. Let's move on. Oh, before I move on, is there anybody wishing to speak as an opponent that isn't listed? Okay. Seeing none, we'll move on to neutral testimony, and I have one neutral conferee, Mr. Caleb Smith.
Members of the House Committee on Elections, thank you for the opportunity to speak. We are neutral on this bill, Kansas Appleseed. And we're neutral. This was a difficult decision for us because there's a lot of good things potentially that could be hidden in this bill. But there's also some sort of concerning things that we wanted to just draw everyone's attention to and urge caution as you consider whether or not to take up this bill or not. So what Kansas Appleseed does during the non-legislative session is essentially we spend a lot of time encouraging people to vote. We do this in a lot of ways that you would probably be familiar with as elected officials. We send texts to people to tell them where their polling location is. We give them reminders. We call, we knock. We do all that sort of stuff. And one of the biggest things that we do as a nonpartisan organization is we just give the when, where, and how. You know, this is where you're going to vote. This is how you do it. You know, this is where, all that good stuff. And drop boxes just consistently. It's one of the problems that we run into is this consistency. With 105 different local election clerks, a lot of times there's 105 different ways to run elections, which can be difficult. When you're someone like Kansas Appleseed who's trying to do this statewide, but also with a focus on smaller counties, rural counties. I focus primarily in southeast Kansas, so we oftentimes deal with some of the smaller counties with the least resources. So a lot of these counties, they just don't have the resources to make that information publicly available and easy to find. So we have to sort of synthesize this information sometimes. We have to make a lot of phone calls. We have to send a lot of emails. And we just sort of have to figure it out. And this is information that probably should be really easy to find for the average voter. Not somebody who has just the time and the resources to spend and just, you know, grind this out, make all these phone calls and just sort of figure it out. So allowing a little bit more regulation from the state level might be able to sort of smooth that out a little bit, and we would encourage that. However, there are some sort of issues that we were concerned about that were sort of mentioned by some of the other conferees. We're really concerned that this could give the opportunity for future secretaries of state to sort of set a ceiling rather than a floor for voting rights and for drop boxes. And it's something that would be really, really sad to see, is someone just making it really hard to use drop boxes in the future. Some of the language that we picked up on was that the Secretary of State would be able to do any other requirements that the Secretary of State deems necessary to regulate drop boxes, which is pretty broad and pretty open-ended. Sort of a Pandora's box that maybe we don't want to open up further down the road. So for these reasons, Kansas Appleseed urges caution on this bill, which could carry a lot of good, but could also have some issues down the line. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much. That's our only neutral testimony. Does anybody have any questions for the conferee? Okay, seeing none. Is there anybody wishing to speak as a neutral that's not listed? Anybody who'd like to speak to the bill at all? Okay, seeing none, we'll close the hearing on House Bill 2053. And I'd like to move to our last order of business, which is action on bills previously heard. I'd like to potentially take action on House Bill 2056. And if I could, I'm springing this on Mr. Heim, but could you remind us what that bill does?
Basically, the bill says that advance ballots have to be turned in by 7 p.m. on Election Day.
All right, are there any questions for Mr. Heim? All right, if not, the chair would entertain a motion on House Bill 2056. Okay, Representative Howell.
So moved.
All right, do I have a second? Okay, I've got a motion and a second to pass out House Bill 2506 favorably. Was that your motion?
Yes. Sorry, Chairman.
What did I say? Oh, is that 2056? Is that your motion?
Yes, Chairman.
Okay.
Thank you.
All right. Is there any discussion? Ranking minority member?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I was under the understanding we were going to do this Thursday, so I had requested an amendment earlier in the day. I'm assuming that is not ready yet. So for that reason, I'll have to be opposed to this today.
All right. Representative Collins.
I just wanted to voice my opposition to this bill because I think 3 days is a reasonable time period, and it was before my time, but when this passed, giving the 3-day grace period, that was, it passed overwhelmingly. People on, Republicans, Democrats, both pretty much agreed on it with, I think, maybe one no vote. But so I just think it's a reasonable grace period, and so for that reason, I'll be voting against it.
Okay. Any Representative Neighbors?
I received many emails on this particular bill. A lot of them are concerned about military votes coming in late and not being able to be counted. We've heard a lot of information today on how the mail works, and it works much slower coming from our troops overseas. I know there's no guarantee, but some people may immediately return them, and some may not be in a position to do that. And I think a lot of eliminating those 3 days takes the opportunity for all people to have a vote. And our country was based on that freedom. And when we have servicemen and women overseas defending us, and then we say your vote doesn't count because the mail didn't get to us, I find that to be disenfranchising rather than encouraging them to vote. And so for that reason, I will have to vote no on this. Thank you.
All right. Are there any other questions or comments? Representative Howell.
Thank you, Chair. As a member of a military family and as a mother of adult children that all went to college, I think that we need to be careful in our zeal to make sure that everyone has the opportunity to vote, that we don't err so much on the side of caution that we insult the intelligence of our voters. our voters understand how to read a deadline. It's part of living in the adult world. As we discussed in the hearing on this bill, I understand that we had full support on both sides, and everyone had great intentions. And as we discussed in that hearing, the United States Postal Service has done nothing but deteriorate, and their functionality has just gone downhill since that time. And I am left with one foundational concern that I don't see another resolution for, and that is we must treat all voters equally, whether they turn in their ballot by mail or whether they vote in person. And because we cannot rely on the United States Postal Service to do their job, let alone perfectly, I think the only way to ensure that a mail ballot is held to the same standard as an in-person ballot is to say that it must be turned in by 7 p.m. on Election Day. And it has nothing to do with security or any concerns about fraud or any of those things. I just think it's a matter of treating every voter equally. Thank you.
Representative Neighbor for the second time.
Thank you. I grew up in the military. My dad was in the Navy for 20 years. Fought in the Bay of Pigs. 2 uncles were also in the military, one in the Navy and one in the Army. And they all took voting very seriously. And I know when they were gone, my dad would be gone 9 months at a time at sea. And then we'd see him for a couple months and he'd be gone again for 9 months. I think I understand equality and equity, but they don't have any control over that. They don't have any control over the mail. None. That's something that only the United States Post Office does. And I think if they're over there protecting us and fighting for us, and one of those rights is the right to vote, they should have that right to have it counted. I don't know that we can ever make anything perfectly equitable because we've got people here and there and all over. But to take that away when it's a constitutional right, and we are one of the only countries that really encourages people to get out and vote, and to take it seriously, and to say it counts, and keep doing it. How many people are going to become disenfranchised because they join the military? And the military needs people right now. They're calling for people. And they may feel, I'm going to be losing my right to vote because it won't get in within that period of time, at no fault of their own. I think we are disenfranchising rather than encouraging. And I think we are taking a personal constitutional privilege away from those who protect us. Thank you.
Mr. Vice Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I would speak in favor of the motion. I can definitely not have big problems with the current system. I know there's a lot of security provisions. I have been involved with some close races, where the postmark on the ballots, was counted or was verified and such. So it's not a question of that. I would address the fundamental fact is 31 other states, have this requirement, and there's a real logic to it that all ballots are in by Election Day. That once Election Day hits, there's no other ballots that can arrive to any voting station that would be counted. Consumer behavior changes. Much the concern about perhaps military ballots. If people know that the deadline is Election Day, people change their behavior. They get it in the mail earlier. I believe military ballots, frankly, or overseas military ballots are sent out 45 days in advance. I mean, there's a really long extended period that they have that other ballots don't. Further, some military ballots, I think, are even done electronically. I think there is a provision for that. I don't know the total details, but that is one place where people can actually vote electronically. But nevertheless, I would say that it puts Kansas, back with the majority of other states that run very clean elections. I think there's a sense of public confidence is improved, where you have the fact that you do not have any ballots except for those that have arrived by Election Day. And I think that would be, to me, the factor that speaks mostly in the favor of returning Kansas back to the standard we had a few years ago. Thank you.
So I believe our ranking minority member has an amendment. I just want to say something here real quick, that we're going to do a conceptual amendment because his amendment's pretty short, and I'm going to allow it because we didn't publish that we were doing this particular bill in the schedule, and so I didn't afford you enough time. But I would like to ask that the committee, that as a committee, we avoid the conceptual amendment, because sometimes people end up voting on things that they didn't realize they voted on because they don't have the black and white in front of them. But with all of those caveats, Mr. Ranking Minority Member, go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So we had discussion in the hearing about whether or not ballots that were dropped off at the polling location, at any polling location in the county, day of, would count or be thrown out. We had conversation about whether or not, if they were received at the county election office drop box, if they'd be counted or not. So given that confusion, my amendment would clarify that to say that if the ballot was returned to the election office, any polling place within the county, or a county election drop box by 7 p.m. on election day, that those would count. So I believe that would amend lines 7, 8, and 9, which is what the revisor provided, to add in or election drop box. I believe we might need to also amend lines 23, 24, 25, and 26, where it says that deadline for receipt by mail of the advanced voting ballots of the election officer. So that's a question for the revisor.
I need to. No. I do understand what the gist is, that it's you drop the ballot off or it is received either at the county election office or a satellite office or in a drop box. It's the official drop box of the county. So wherever that needs to be added, I can add, but that's the gist of the amendment.
Okay, so I have a motion for an amendment. Do I have a second? Okay, second by Representative Howe. Is there any discussion on the amendment? Okay, Representative Berquist.
I appreciate the representative's amendment. That meets all of the concerns that I would have, other than the fact that I believe that the whole issue has been of personal responsibility, and that we have the constitutional right to vote, and so we want to protect that by voting with our own assurity that it's gonna get through, and by having it to the polling place by the 7 o'clock that day, and by having it in the box that's official that day. The measures that the representative just presented, I think, meet those, and the rest of those concerns, and we're talking about the amendment right now, but I would support that. Thank you.
Is there any more comments or questions about the amendment? All right, seeing none, Representative, you can close on your amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I close.
Okay, you've heard the motion. All in favor indicate by saying aye. Aye. All opposed, no. The ayes appear to have it. The ayes have it. We're back on the bill as amended. Is there any more questions, comments, concerns? Okay, seeing none and it being 5-5, I'll ask Representative Howe, will you renew your motion as amended?
Yes, Mr. Chair, I would like to propose that we vote on this bill as amendment and move it forward favorably.
All right, will you renew your second? All right, you've heard the motion. All in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. All opposed, say no. The ayes appear to have it. Okay, a division's been called. So all those in favor of the motion passing favorably as amended, please indicate by raising your hand and keep it up so we can count. I'm not voting, I'm sorry. Rookie mistake. Okay. Okay, all opposed? Okay, the ayes appear to have it. Okay. All right, there being no further business before the committee, is there anything for the good of the order? Okay, seeing none, we're adjourned.